guys, and welcome to our discussion for Chapter 3, Integrating Technology and Media into Instruction. We're going to talk about the Assure model in Chapter 3, and our knowledge outcomes for Chapter 3 are based on its CNET standards 2, 4, and 5. We're going to talk about the primary types of learner analysis criteria. We're going to describe the role for that criteria in the systematic planning process for learning, and build a lesson plan. We're going to discuss the rationale and purposes for learning objectives. We're going to write learning objectives that include an audience, behavior, condition, and degree of mastery. We're going to discuss and describe the procedures for selecting, modifying, and designing instructional materials, and indicating when those choices are appropriate. We're going to create examples of the 5 basic steps in utilizing technology, media, and materials. We're going to describe and justify methods for student participation when using technology and media. And then we're going to compare and contrast the techniques for evaluating student achievement, technology, media strategies for instruction. So the first thing we want to talk about is the Assure model. And the chapter examines how to plan systematically for the effective use of technology and media. And we've constructed this procedural model which will give you the acronym ASSURE, which stands for Analyzing Your Learners, Stating Standards and Objectives, Selecting Strategies, Technology, Media, and Materials, Utilizing those materials, requiring learner participation, and evaluating and revising. So when analyzing your learner, the Assure model takes you through the process of determining what characteristics that impact the ability of the student to learn. The analysis information that's used in the lesson plan is tailored to meet the needs of your students. The learner analysis examines general characteristics, specific entry competencies, and learning styles. General characteristics include things like gender or ethnicity, and also attitudes or levels of interest. Also, things that you have to consider are age differences that you may have in a classroom. Gender differences in mixed gender groups can also affect the way your groups work together, especially in early elementary classes. And some students may be inhibited, especially in middle school, whenever you have mixed gender classes. So you have to consider how those affect one another. Also, multiple ethnic groups and the way that they integrate. High priorities should be considered for cultural identity and values. And then also, you need to consider when selecting photographs and clip art for your instructional materials that you use pictures of children with the same ethnicity as the students in your class, and it will help to increase their connection to the lesson or topic. While you do want to create a well-rounded classroom, you also want the students to be able to relate and connect to the curriculum. And once you have this background, general understanding of who your student is, you can couple that with your observations of the student attitudes and their interest in the topics to implement a meaningful lesson that will address the unique needs of that particular student. Entry-level competencies is another thing to consider when analyzing your learner. You want to identify the specific entry competencies of your student. You can do this through just, a simple poll in your classroom or a survey. You can also do it more formally, with a standardized test that gives you formal results. Entry tests are assessments that will determine whether your students possess the necessary prerequisites or competencies to benefit from your instruction. Learning styles is something that we need to discuss for Chapter 3 because it's important that you understand how your students will most effectively learn, and the information that you will learn from analyzing the general characteristics and entry competencies and learning styles of your students will help you in your decision-making process as you're designing your Assure lesson plan. You can see in your textbook that there are some examples of some case studies throughout Chapter 3, and I advise you to read through those. There's a good one on page 40. There are others throughout the chapter that you'll probably want to review before you get started creating your own. The second part of the Assure model is to state your standards and objectives, and this is probably one of the most difficult parts for students to understand. I will tell you that there is a great resource for you on page 43, and pages 40 through 43 really describe very, very succinctly what the ABCD method is and how to create strong learning objectives. ABCD stands for audience, behavior, condition, and degree. And it's important that your learning objectives address all four of those major categories. You want to be sure that you know who your audience is, who is your student that these objectives are being directed to. You want to ask, what behavior are you going to require of them? Under what conditions will they be required to perform that behavior? And then to what degree of mastery are you expecting of the student? So make sure that your objectives are clear and concise, but address all four of those major components. And the checklist at the bottom of page 43 will really help you. When you're talking about audience, that's really the first section of the Assure model. When you are analyzing your learner, you understand who they are, where they've been, and where they need to be. And so once you understand, who your learner is, then you can more clearly address what the objectives are for that learner. So with your audience is your student, and then whatever needs that they have. Some of your students may have learning disabilities. Some of your students may have physical disabilities, or other conditions that would affect their learning. So you need to be aware. Your behavior, the heart of your objective is your verb, your action words that are describing the capability that the learners will have after instruction. And the verb should be stated as an observable behavior, such as define or categorize or demonstrate. Stay away from vague terms such as know or understand or appreciate, things that you can't measure. You want to have an observable performance. If you look at the helpful 100 list on the table 3.2, it offers verbs that highlight performance, and that's at the bottom of page 42. This is a really helpful chart, and it will really help you when you're trying to put together your learning objectives. These are words like choose, classify, compare, identify, illustrate, remove, translate, verify, those type of things. So take a look at that chart. And then when you get to the conditions, your learning objectives should include conditions which the performance is to be assessed. So in other words, what materials or tools will the students be allowed or not allowed to use when they're demonstrating mastery of this objective? For example, given a list of earthquake occurrences over the past 100 years, the student will generate, there's your action verb, a line graph to demonstrate trends over time. So that's an example of what an objective might state. An objective for a language arts objective might say, without references, and there's your condition, the student, there's your audience, will write, there's your action verb, that's the behavior, a 300-word essay on the relationship of nutrition to learning. So 300-word essay would be your degree. So that's pretty clear. I think we've diagrammed that one pretty clearly for you. If you are still unclear about learning objectives and how to write clear learning objectives, I do have some resources for you in Angel under the Resources tab, so you can check those out. Okay, the next section of the Assure model discusses selecting your strategies, technology, media, and materials. And this is a really easy section. You should be able to get this one fairly quickly. This is just going to be all of the things that you're going to utilize in your lesson. So any types of computer technology, projectors, if you plan to use a smartboard or a Promethean board, an Elmo, or any of those tools. This would also include the curriculum that you're going to use, so that would be a textbook. If you're going to do an activity, that would be any materials that you're going to need. So if you were going to do like a science experiment or a demonstration, you'd need to list all of those materials as well. Let's see. So we have analyzed the learner. We have stated standards and objectives. We have selected strategies, technology, and media. And the next section of the Assure model lesson plan will be to utilize that technology, media, and materials. So everything that you select and list in the section on media and materials should now be described how you're going to use it in your lesson under the Use section. So that will include how you plan to prepare the technology and materials. So if there's anything you need to do ahead of time before the lesson to prepare for the class. Also preparing the learners. So if there are prerequisites to the learning that the student needs to know, this needs to be listed here in the Utilize section. Any research that the students need to do, or any prior knowledge that they need to have. This could include broad overviews of lesson content, a rationale telling how the content relates to real-world applications, a motivating statement that creates a need to know the content, or cues directing attention to specific aspects of the lesson. And then finally, the last and most important part of this section is how you're actually going to provide the learning experience. So now that you're ready to provide the instructional experience, a teacher-centered learning experience often involves presentation or demonstration, drill and practice type of activities or tutorials, and then a learner-centered environment would be more centered on what students would be doing. The next part of the Assure model is the required learner participation. So this is going to be what you're going to require of the students for the lesson. The objectives for your lesson should explicitly state what the students are expected to do after instruction. So it's critical to require learner participation through explicit practice with the new knowledge and skills that you're providing. And this is the section where you would discuss that. Chapter does place emphasis on feedback, and on page 55 you can see a paragraph there about how learners should receive feedback on the correctness of their responses. Feedback can come from the teacher or the student. It may work in small groups, or they may give one another feedback. Feedback can also come from part of a self-assessment or an activity done independently or with a mentor, or even from computerized assessments. The final and last section of your Assure model lesson plan will include evaluation and revision. And this is also very important because without this step, it's impossible to know whether or not your instruction was successful or how to revise the strategies that were not successful. So Assessing learner achievement is really important, and ultimately the question regarding instruction is whether students have learned what they were supposed to learn. So can they demonstrate the capabilities that are specified in the stated standards and objectives that you set for your lesson? When you formulate your learning objectives, including a criterion of acceptable performance, you need to be thinking about how you're going to assess those objectives at the end. You need to develop assessment tasks that require students to demonstrate the behavior stated in the objectives. The method of assessing achievement depends on the nature of the objectives. Some learning objectives call for simple cognitive skills, and others are more complicated. Some call for process-type behaviors. Some call for the creation of a product, producing a project or an exhibit of a specific attitude. There's all different kinds of ways to measure assessment. And so you need to consider how it is you're going to measure what you're expecting your student to learn. There are some great charts on pages 56 and 57 for performance checklists. This one is using an audio storybook, and it discusses whether or not the student learned specific competencies listed. And so it kind of goes through whether or not they located the storybook, whether or not they completed the checkout of the book. Did they select the appropriate CD player and headphones? So those are all things you can run through as sort of an example. There's also an attitude scale for biology, so that's kind of on a Likert scale, strongly disagree, strongly agree. You can kind of look at those assessments. And then there are some rubrics and digital concept maps on page 58 and 59. The general description of the Assure model is on page 39, towards the beginning of the chapter. And it gives you a brief summary of each section of the lesson plan. And I will show you also in Angel, I have posted here under the Lessons tab. Let's see. And under Midterm Project, this is where you'll find all of the resources for building your Assure Model lesson plan. And this is the midterm project, so it's not due for quite a few weeks. But it's something that you need to go ahead and get started on because it will take quite a bit of time. And this is something you'll want to turn in and revise probably a number of times before you get your full points. So you can use Google Docs, or you can use the template that I've provided here. This is a template that was created by Marty Watson, and it discusses volcanoes, I believe. And it will walk you through each section of the Assure model. And so you can see here, we have a section on analyzing the learner. We talked about the age ranges, the gender differences, the learning disabilities or cultural notes, prerequisites, learner attitudes, and learning styles. In lab this week, we will be doing a learning styles inventory, so we'll talk a little bit more about learning styles at that time. But there are three main categories of learning styles: visual, auditory, and kinesthetic. The second section here on stating objectives and frameworks, you will need to be sure to create your ABC objectives, including the audience, behavior, condition, and degree. And this should say audience, not action. And then also you'll want to correlate those with either frameworks or Common Core standards, depending on what age you have designated. So we can talk about that on Thursday as well. Your next section, selecting media and materials. This is where you'll place all of those items. Utilizing the media and materials, this is where you'll discuss how they're going to be used. Your section next would be for learner participation. and then evaluation and revision. And it's important that in the evaluation and revision section that you address not only the student performance, but also the effectiveness of your media and then your own skills as an instructor. So there's a number of different ways that you can measure those. When you're discussing the performance of students, obviously you have assessments for that. So whether that's quizzes or tests or through creation of a project or measurement of certain performances, then your media effectiveness would be measured most likely through more reflective activities, observance of the classroom environment, how things went, whether or not something was broken or not working, with student feedback on the activity or the lesson. And then also similar for your instructor performance, but you may want to be a little more specific there. You could give a student survey. You could have a peer come in and do some evaluation. Obviously, you wouldn't do that all the time, but those are some examples of ways that you can monitor and evaluate your own performance. So this is the template for you to use, and you'll see that there's also back in the midterm project folder, there are sample lesson plans for you to look at. There's another resource for goals and objectives. There's a link to the NET standards from the ISTE website. There's a link to the Arkansas education frameworks. And then I will need to add a link for Common Core standards, but we're going to talk about that a little bit on Thursday. And I have some apps for you to download. And then, of course, you have the Dropbox here to submit your project when you're finished. That wraps up our discussion on the Assure model. I hope that you'll come to class on Thursday excited to build your lesson plan.